At 9:42 a.m. on July 13, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Grubb Cullen watched General Omar Bradley step out of a jeep near St. Lo. The sergeant knew the next 30 seconds would determine whether 3,000 American tanks could finally break through Normandy's nightmarish Bocage. Cullen was 29 years old. He had spent just 2 weeks testing his strange device, and he had exactly zero official approval. Everything rested on this single high-stakes demonstration. If his invention failed, the breakout would fail, and the stalemate that was costing thousands of lives would continue. The general looked on, waiting. The test was about to begin. The problem was the landscape itself. The American tankers called it the Bocage, but the name was deceptive. These weren't the green, leafy hedges of the English countryside. They were fortresses. For centuries, French farmers had piled field stones along their property lines. Over medieval times, dirt accumulated and trees grew, creating a monstrous network of earthen walls. Each hedgerow was a 12-foot-high, 4-foot-thick barrier of compacted earth, reinforced by centuries of dense root growth. This was the green hell of Normandy. It was a tactical nightmare nobody had solved. And in just 6 weeks, this ancient, impenetrable landscape had already cost the First Army over 400 Sherman tanks. The American tankers had only one futile option: try to go over. The moment a 33-ton Sherman tried to climb the 12-foot wall, its nose pitched upward, fatally exposing its undercarriage. This was the Sherman's critical flaw. Its belly armor was only 1 inch thick, and the Germans knew it. Hidden in the next hedgerow, German Panzerfaust teams and anti-tank gunners waited for that exact moment. They aimed for that spot. The result was a slaughter. A single well-placed shot would rip through the tank, and in the ensuing inferno, most Sherman crews burned before they could bail out. It was a death trap, repeated field after field, and it was stalling the entire invasion. The generals at high command were trying to solve it, but everything they tried failed. Command allocated 4 M4 dozer tanks per battalion. These tanks, fitted with bulldozer blades, could push through a hedgerow, but they were agonizingly slow, and the moment they appeared, every German gunner for miles made them the #1 priority target. Engineers tried packing explosives into the hedgerow bases. The blasts barely dented the 500-year-old earthen walls and only served as a dinner bell for German artillery. In desperation, some crews just tried ramming the hedges at full speed. The Shermans simply buried themselves, nose first, into a wall of compacted earth and roots, becoming stationary targets. The experts were stumped. The advance was stalled, and the American army was trapped. The solution didn't come from a general's briefing. It came from a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. His name was Curtis Cullen, and he had spent days probing these deadly hedgerows, watching tanks fail. While the experts were stumped, Cullen was looking at something everyone else saw as trash. On the invasion beaches, thousands of German-planted obstacles called Czech hedgehogs lay rusting. These were massive jack-shaped barriers built from 3 thick railway iron beams designed to rip the hulls of landing craft. American engineers were simply cutting them apart with torches and stockpiling the heavy German steel. To them, it was scrap metal. But to Cullen, it was the solution. He didn't see junk, he saw a weapon. Cullen took 4 sections of that heavy hedgehog steel, each piece 2 inches thick. He welded them to the bow plate of a light tank, angling the prongs forward 35 degrees. The logic was absurdly simple. Instead of trying to climb over the hedge and exposing its belly, the steel tusks would strike the base. The tank wouldn't climb. It would dig in and push straight through. He tested the device 7 times on a light tank. 7 successful breaches. No belly exposure. The concept was proven, but would the device hold up on a 33-ton Sherman? That was the real test. Word of the successful tests rocketed to headquarters. General Bradley himself ordered a personal demonstration for July 13th. This was it. Lieutenant Charles Greene's 33-ton Sherman, now weighing 320 pounds more, faced the enemy. Cullen stood next to Bradley as the general pointed to a 12-foot-high hedgerow thick as a fortress wall. "Proceed," Bradley said. The Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour. It struck the earthen wall with the sound of a freight train collision. Dirt exploded upward. The tank's nose dipped, pushing for 3 agonizing seconds against 500 years of compacted earth and roots. Then the prongs bit through. The hedge collapsed inward. The Sherman burst through to the other side. Total breach time, 14 seconds. Bradley lowered his binoculars. He walked to the gap, touched the torn earth, and then turned to his staff with one question. "How many of these can we produce?" Major General J. Rowe looked at Cullen. "The beach obstacles provide enough steel for approximately 500 devices," he said. Bradley didn't hesitate. "I want 3,000. The order was staggering. Operation Cobra, the all-or-nothing breakout offensive, was scheduled for July 25th. That was 12 days away. The math was brutal. To meet Bradley's demand, the Ordnance Group would need to modify 3,000 armored vehicles. That meant 250 tanks per day, 10 tanks per hour, 1 tank fully modified every 6 minutes. Cullen's invention had worked, but he had just created an impossible new problem. If you want to see if Cullen's beach trash cutters actually worked in combat, hit that like button right now and subscribe. Cullen had 12 days to find out if his junkyard invention would break the stalemate, or mean absolutely nothing when German anti-tank guns open fire. Because what happens next is insane. The race against time began. That evening, General Bradley issued the orders. Every available welder in Normandy would work 24-hour shifts. Operation Cobra was just 12 days away. Captain James Dye from the 52nd Ordnance Group arrived at the production site near Columbia on July 14th with 30 welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. The task before them seemed impossible. A nondescript field in Normandy was suddenly transformed. It looked like an industrial factory dropped from the sky into the French countryside. Welders worked through the night, their stations illuminated by floodlights powered by mobile generators. Sparks from their cutting torches lit up the darkness, revealing endless rows of Shermans waiting for their tusks. The air was thick with the smell of hot metal and welding flux. Nobody slept more than 4 hours. This was a desperate sprint against the clock, with the lives of 14,000 men on the line. But the sprint hit a wall. Nothing worked perfectly. The German trash steel was harder than standard construction grade. It absorbed thermal energy differently, causing the cutting torches to overheat after just 20 minutes. The first day's frantic production yielded a pathetic 8 completed devices, 8 tanks out of 3,000. At that rate, the Ordnance Group would finish sometime in October. Operation Cobra would have launched and failed long ago. And then a second, more critical flaw emerged. The 320-pound 4-prong assembly shifted the Sherman's center of gravity forward by 6 inches. After repeated test impacts, the front suspension springs on several vehicles showed alarming stress fractures. The invention that was supposed to save the tanks was now breaking them. If those springs failed in combat, the tank would be immobilized with a broken front end, trapped in the open, and a perfect target. Cullen, an engineer at heart, immediately tackled the suspension crisis. He modified the mounting system. Instead of bolting the 320-pound device directly to the bow, he designed reinforcement brackets that distributed the immense weight and impact force across the hull's entire structural frame. It was another brilliant fix. It added 30 minutes to each installation, but it prevented the catastrophic suspension damage. The production line roared back to life, but by July 22nd, a new crisis hit. The steel ran out. They had processed every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. With the deadline looming, ordnance groups scrambled for an alternative. They found one: railroad tracks. The tracks were softer than the German steel, but available in quantity. Lieutenant Green's battalion had already experimented with them, welding massive railroad tie prongs to their tanks in a crude but effective version they called the Green Dozer. The production line pivoted, shifting to a hybrid model. Cullen's hedgehog cutters for units with steel, and railroad prongs for everyone else. On July 24th, the modified tanks moved to their forward assembly areas. 2,300 Rhino tanks were ready. It wasn't the 3,000 Bradley wanted, but it was enough. Sergeant Cullen walked through the staging zones near Marigny, watching column after column of Shermans roll past. Every single tank now carried 4 crude steel prongs on its bow. They looked absurd, almost prehistoric, like ancient animals equipped for a new kind of war. But as Cullen stood there, sleepless for 72 hours, his hands covered in burns, he understood something profound. Those steel prongs represented 14,000 men who might now survive the breakout, 14,000 soldiers who wouldn't burn to death by exposing their tank bellies to German guns. Whether the devices actually worked in combat would be determined in approximately 9 hours. July 25th, 6:11 a.m. Operation Cobra began. The ground near St. Lo shook as 2,500 Allied bombers dropped 4,000 tons of explosives on the German positions. Then at 7:45 a.m., the first Rhino tanks crossed into the Bocage. Every tank carried Cullen's 4-pronged device or the railroad-based variant. The radio reports started coming through at 8:15 a.m., and they were electrifying. Company B's lead Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour, struck the earthen wall, and pushed through in 16 seconds. More reports followed. Company C breached 3 hedgerows in 20 minutes. Company A pushed through 5 consecutive hedge lines without stopping. The pattern repeated across the entire assault front. The Germans were completely unprepared. Their entire defensive doctrine was built on American tanks climbing over the hedges and exposing their vulnerable belly armor. When the Rhinos punched straight through at ground level, every anti-tank gun and Panzerfaust team's firing solution became instantly worthless. By 10:30 a.m., the 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles, a distance that had previously taken 3 days. The stalemate was broken, but the devices weren't perfect, and the reports of failure started coming in around 11:02 a.m. A Sherman from the 751st Tank Battalion hit a hedgerow with a buried stone foundation. The prongs bent backward on impact, and the tank couldn't move. The crew had to abandon the vehicle under machine gun fire. 2 men died getting out. Another light tank's prongs broke off completely when they struck an iron fence post hidden in the hedge base. The failure rate was calculated at approximately 4%. This wasn't catastrophic, but it was significant. 4% of 2,300 tanks meant 92 devices would likely fail during Cobra. That was 92 crews, potentially trapped in open fields with German guns zeroing in on them. Cullen's invention was a massive leap forward, but it was not a miracle. That 4% failure rate was a grim statistic, representing 92 crews who paid the price for variables that couldn't be tested. But the math of the breakout was even clearer. By 1:30 p.m. on the first day, a report came through that changed everything. A battalion had advanced 4 miles, 6 hours. That same distance had taken 2 weeks in June. The German defensive network, which had held for 42 days, had collapsed. The stalemate was shattered. On August 15th, Sergeant Cullen was summoned to General Bradley's headquarters. Bradley was waiting. He slid a document across the desk, a recommendation for the Legion of Merit, the 4th highest military decoration, almost never given to an enlisted man. Bradley stated it plainly. Your hedgerow cutting device saved an estimated 1/500 American lives. When Cullen, stunned, replied, "Sir, I just welded some steel to tanks," Bradley set the record straight. You solved a tactical problem that stopped First Army for 6 weeks. Every tank commander from here to Paris knows your name. The 4% failure was the cost of innovation. The 1/500 lives saved, that was the victory. The official legacy of the Cullen hedge-cutting device exists in military doctrine manuals and behind museum glass. But that's not its real legacy. The real legacy isn't made of steel. It's measured in lives. It's the 1/500 crewmen who didn't burn to death in a Norman field. 1/500 soldiers who survived the breakout, finished the war, and went home. Those men had children, and those children had children. The number of people alive today, walking this earth right now, because Curtis Cullen welded German trash to a tank is incalculable. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. That is the true impact. It's an entire forest of family trees that were never cut down, all sprouting from the seed of one sergeant's idea. He died thinking his contribution was a footnote. He never knew he had changed the world for generations of people who would never even know his name. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories like this every week. But most importantly, drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Curtis Cullen and the 1/500 men he saved don't disappear into silence.